Hello. I'm back with Hardy Boys while the clock ticked. And I hope you guys enjoy. I'll be reading 3 chapters today. Okay? All right. Okay, I'll just go over a little summary of the previous chapter and I'll read the last page. Okay? So the previous chapter was about Meteor Special, which was a limousine car. And it said, "Oh, my lands, what's the difference? It's still a death threat," Aunt Gertrude cried. "There's a big difference," Joe stated. "I'm glad you got this letter." His aunt stared at him in bewilderment, but Frank nodded understanding. "I get it," he said. "We thought we weren't making headway on Mr. Dalrymple's case. This note proves that we are. We have somebody worried." "You have me worried," Aunt Gertrude sighed. "Mr. Dalrymple's in danger, and so are you." At that moment the telephone rang. Aunt Gertrude started. "If it's another threat—" She broke off as Frank took the call. He picked up a pencil from the stand and jotted something on a pad. "That was Chief Colleague," Frank announced after he had hung up. "The motor vehicle office has 8 owners of Meteor Specials registered in this area. Here's the list. One is a Mr. Henry Nichols, who lives closest to us. Come on, Joe, let's go." Okay, so that was the previous chapter. Now we're on chapter 13, The Eavesdropper. Mr. Henry Nichols' home turned out to be a large one in Bayport's most attractive residential section. "Frank!" Joe grabbed his brother's arm and pointed to the garage. Showing through the open door were the black fenders and shining grill of a new Meteor Special. "Good afternoon, boys," called an old man seated in a rocking chair on the front porch. "Hot weather." "Sure is," Frank agreed. "Are you Mr. Nichols?" "Yes, sirree." The old man was very thin and weak looking, but his light blue eyes were lively. "I've been Henry Nichols 79 years now. 80 next April. Never minded it either, except when I was young. Then I used to wish I was somebody famous." "Henry?" called a voice just inside the screen door. "That's enough." A small white-haired woman stood there. "What is it you boys want?" Frank said politely. "We came to ask about your car." "Don't drive those machines myself," Mr. Nichols piped up. "I drove a team of horses and did some harness racing." Mrs. Nichols interrupted proudly. "Boys, I drive the car." "How do you like your Meteor Special?" Joe asked her. "Ride's nice, and it's fast. I love a speedy car." Frank and Joe were amused by the couple, but did not smile. "Do a lot of driving?" Frank asked. "Well, shopping downtown and to church." Mr. Nichols chuckled. "When Ma gets to going, I say to myself, 'Henry, buckle your seatbelt.'" Frank and Joe grinned, but thought Mrs. Nichols' Meteor clearly was not the one they were after. "Thanks for your time," Frank said to the couple. "We're very much interested in Meteor Specials." Back in their convertible, the Hardys looked at the 7 remaining names on the list. It was now late in the afternoon. "We better split up if we're going to cover these people," Frank advised. "I'll drive you home so you can get Dad's car." When the Hardys returned home from their quest, each reported no luck. None of the owners of Meteor Specials had resembled Mr. Dalrymple. "There's one possible answer," Frank deduced. "The car this key belongs to may have been brought here from a distance. Probably it's using stolen plates." "Yes, but where is it?" Joe wondered. The young detectives were forced to go to bed with the question unanswered. The next morning after breakfast, Frank and Joe found a bright and eager Chet Morton seated on the Hardy doorstep. "You said to give you a day or 2, so here I am," he announced. "Right on schedule," Joe grinned as the brothers sat down with their friend. They told him of their efforts to catch the harbor thieves, solve Mr. Dalrymple's mystery, and find the missing jade articles. "Wow, I can hardly keep 'em all straight," said the stout boy. "Well, I'll be on the lookout for the meteor special." "Good," responded Joe. "If you spot it, let us know on the double." "Count on me," raising his right hand and placing his left over his heart. Chet declaimed. I think it's exclaimed. "Let it never be said that Chet Morton forsook his companions in the hour of distress. Let the thieves do their worst. Chet Morton defies them." Okay, Frank laughed. "Is Chet Morton ready to go now?" "Lead on," Chet said, waving. "I follow." "But where?" "To see Mr. Dalrymple," Frank replied. "It's time he knew his property's being used by the harbor thieves." "And we'll show him the warning that was sent to Aunt Gertrude," Joe added. Soon the Hardys' convertible was carrying the three boys along the highway from Bayport to Lakeside. Once in town, they drove to the leading bank, of which Mr. Dalrymple was an officer. He received the boys in his office and listened intently as the Hardys told of their suspicions. "Criminals using my house!" he exploded. "Outrageous! But it explains the notes. Those thieves are trying to scare me away, and you boys too." "Yes," Frank agreed, "but it still doesn't explain how the messages were put into the time-locked room." "That's true," the banker admitted. "But what else have you found?" Frank described the theft of the jade necklace Captain Stroman had purchased for his wife in the Orient, probably by the same thief who stole Herd Applegate's collection. To the boys' surprise, Mr. Dalrymple disagreed sharply. "No connection at all," he snapped. "I'm convinced that Applegate is suffering from hallucinations. His whole story is preposterous." The boys rose to leave, promising to keep the banker posted. To their disappointment, he had again forgotten to have a set of house keys made. Back on the road to Bayport, the young detectives considered Dalrymple's remark about Mr. Applegate. "What do you think, Frank?" Joe asked. "Did Herd Applegate really lose any jade?" Frank said emphatically, "I think Mr. Dalrymple's still angry about being called a thief, but it won't hurt to have another talk with Mr. Applegate." Suddenly, both Hardys noticed that Chet's attention had been diverted. He stared longingly ahead. "What's so interesting?" Joe asked. "Don't pass it," pleaded Chet. "Pass what?" "That milk bar up there. They serve a terrific sundae covered with whipped cream, cherries, and nuts. It's called a Bigloo Igloo. Come on, fellows, it's lunchtime." "Okay," Frank laughed. The yellow convertible turned in and stopped before the little white building. Soon the boys were seated together in a booth. "4 Bigloo Igloos," ordered Chet when the waitress came over. "But there are only 3 of you, sir," the waitress protested. "4 sundaes, miss," Chet repeated grandly. "Never fear, we shall dispose of them." The waitress shrugged and went off. The place was filled with people on their lunch hour, and there was a lively hubbub. A jukebox was playing continuously. Suddenly, through the noise, Frank heard a voice behind him say, "It will happen while the clock ticks." The youth abruptly stood up, whirling for a look at the speaker. His foot swung out into the aisle, tripping the waitress, who was returning with the boy's order. Crash! Down went the girl. Up went 4 enormous Bigloo Igloo sundaes. Chet Morton stared aghast as 2 of them came down on his head. The others had found resting places on the floor. Above the shrieks of the waitress and the roars of laughter from the other customers, Frank cried, "Joe! Those 2 men who just went out! We must catch them!" Pushing through the clogged aisle, the brothers paid the disconcerted waitress, then emerged from the milk bar in time to see a black car carrying two men speed away in the direction of Bayport. The fellow driving was tall. Looked like Dalrymple, called Frank as he sprinted for the convertible. Joe followed, hurrying Chet, head still streaked with ice cream, along in front of him. They climbed into their car and gave chase. The convertible slewed into the road with a squeal of rubber on concrete. By this time, the other car was only a black dot on the highway ahead. Grimly, Frank pressed the accelerator to the floor. If it's the Meteor Special, you'll never catch it, Chet grumbled. That car wasn't a meteor, Frank told him. The highway rose, dipped, and turned. Sometimes the black dot was visible, sometimes not. Then, with a long straightaway in sight, it seemed to have disappeared altogether. They've ducked into the Willow River Road, Frank guessed. In a moment he made the turn himself and raced along the familiar route. At the Purdy estate the gate was closed, and no car stood inside. Frank went on. He reached Shore Road without seeing a sign of the strange car. Lost 'em, Frank muttered in disgust. Joe, too, frowned dejectedly. Well, we may as well go see Mr. Applegate at Tower Mansion, he suggested. It's right on this road. The boys continued driving for some distance, until finally they glimpsed an immense stone structure high on a hill overlooking the bay. The palatial building had the appearance of a feudal castle because of the two huge stone towers which arose from the far ends of it. Joe and Frank never failed to be impressed by the enormity of the old Tower Mansion and its well-kept, fence-enclosed grounds whenever their car climbed the wide driveway that led to the front entrance. The elderly Mr. Applegate looked sad as he opened the door, yet he seemed glad to see the Hardys and their friend. He invited them into his living room. Boys, the old man said, you helped me when my stamps were stolen, and I would have been lost without you the other night. If you can possibly get back my jade, I'll see that you're rewarded. You mean you want us to take the case, Mr. Applegate? Joe asked. You can find my jade collection if anyone can, the elderly man declared firmly. Suddenly, Joe, Chet, and Herd Applegate stared at Frank Hardy in astonishment. He had risen quietly from his chair and was tiptoeing stealthily toward the side window. What? What is it? Chet gasped. Somebody in the yard, listening to us, Frank whispered. With that, he raced through the house toward the rear door. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. It's entitled Sudden Attack. As Frank burst from the back door, a man hurdled the hedge at the end of the Applegate's garden and sprinted through the rear of the property. The eavesdropper's tan sports jacket flapped behind him as he ran. He scaled the iron picket fence with the agility of a monkey and dropped to the roadway beyond. The man glanced backward, and Frank saw that he was heavily bearded. Up we go, fellows, Frank urged. In seconds, the young sleuth, too, had cleared the fence. Behind him came Joe's pounding footsteps. Chet Morton, panting audibly, brought up the rear. They, too, scaled the fence. Frank was looking up and down the roadway, puzzled. His quarry was no longer in sight. A young man, wearing a striped blue jacket, stood on the opposite side of the road, staring at two large, newly constructed houses. Instantly, Frank called to him, Hey! Seen a man with a beard? Right there, between those houses, the young man pointed. Was he running away from you? Frank and his companions did not reply, but raced on between the houses. Still no sign of the stranger. The boys were in the midst of a housing development. While Frank hurried forward to inspect the next street, Joe and Chet searched every possible hiding place in the yards. But it was no use. The boys had lost the eavesdropper completely. Bad break for us, Joe grumbled. As the breathless trio retraced their steps, they noticed that the stranger in the blue jacket had disappeared. Do you suppose he was telling the truth? Chet asked. The Hardys shrugged. Herd Applegate was waiting for them on his back porch. No luck, Mr. Applegate, said Joe to the old collector. but we'll take your case. We'll find the stolen jade. 10 o'clock the next morning found the Hardy Boys on the sidewalks of downtown Bayport. They were on their way to police headquarters to check on any new developments in the harbor mystery. It was a hot, sunny day. Already the stores were lowering awnings over their display windows. Frank, look! Joe pointed to a tall figure in a straw hat. His back was turned as he inspected the contents of a store window across the street. It's Dalrymple. Wonder what he's doing in town. We'd better speak to him, responded Frank. He might be on his way to the Purdy place in spite of our warning. Crossing at the corner, the boys went up and touched their client's shoulder. As the man whirled, Frank and Joe stepped back in surprise. He was not Mr. Dalrymple. What do you want? The stranger demanded roughly. You're the man who stole Herd Applegate's jade, Joe fearlessly accused him. What jade? I don't know what you're talking about. I never saw you before. You watch your tongue. I could sue you. Shoving past the boys, he darted around some pedestrians and threw himself into the front seat of a black car parked at the curb. At that moment, the light changed to green. The stranger's automobile was sucked into a river of traffic which surged forward until the light changed. Why did we let him go? Joe stormed. We could be wrong, Frank told his brother. Anyway, I got the license number. We'll give it to Chief Colleague. It wasn't a Meteor Special, Joe noted. Maybe that's the car we chased yesterday. Eagerly, the boys hurried to headquarters. So you think you may have seen the thief? Colleague exclaimed. Your friend Dalrymple just called. He doesn't believe such a man as his double exists. He exists, all right, answered Frank. Here's the number of the car he was driving. Immediately, the resources of a modern police department were brought into play. The strange car was found to be registered in the name of James Black of Bayport. When questioned on the telephone, Mr. Black said he was about to call the police himself to report that his car had been stolen. Better come down and tell us about it, Mr. Black, said the officer into the phone. Within half an hour, a well-dressed, slight, middle-aged man was escorted by a patrolman into the chief's office. Frank and Joe, meanwhile, had concealed themselves in an adjoining room. Tell us about your car, Mr. Black, the chief began. Where do you keep it? Why, in my garage. Frank and Joe noted that while facing the chief, the man kept averting his eyes. Mighty bold thief to take your car from your garage, Chief Colleague remarked. As a matter of fact, it was parked at the curb in front of the house. When? Last night? Yes, that's it. Last night. So, Mr. Black, your car was stolen sometime last night. Must have upset you. Yes, the man stammered. I've been a nervous wreck ever since I discovered it was gone, right after I got up this morning. Of course. What time do you get up? About 7. And you noticed the car was gone then? Pursued the chief. It was 10:30 when I called you, Mr. Black. You say you were upset about your car being stolen, yet you let 3 hours go by before reporting it to the police? For a moment, James Black blinked in silence, obviously disconcerted. Here, you can't browbeat me this way, he blustered. I just didn't realize my car was actually stolen. That's all. You act like you're trying to accuse me of a crime. If you ask me, Mr. Black, you act like a man who's been accused of a crime. Well, you haven't anything on me, the stranger snapped suddenly. I don't have a record. You can't hold me without charges. Charges? Said Colleague politely. I thought you came to make a complaint, Mr. Black. Now that you've made it, you may as well go. As soon as the man left, Frank and Joe stepped into the office. That guy might be on the level, declared Joe, but he sure doesn't give me that impression. Chief Colleague nodded in agreement. We'll watch him, he promised. Best way to catch a crook is to make him believe you decided he's innocent. When the brothers reached home, Aunt Gertrude was on the phone talking with Chet. Here they come now, she said, but no sleuthing this afternoon. Our grass is high enough to turn a herd of cows into, and the flower beds are full of weeds. Frank and Joe aren't going off this property until this place looks respectable again. As Miss Hardy turned the phone over to Frank, she gave him a look that which plainly meant no arguments. For this reason, dusk was falling before the two detectives were free to leave. As the streetlights winked on, a 10-year-old car pulled up in front of the Hardys' house. Flashlights in hand, Frank and Joe came down to join Chet Morton, who sat at the car's wheel. "Where to?" he asked. "Tonight, we try out the third key on the chain the jeweler gave us," Frank replied as they drove off. "My guess is that it fits the front door in the Purdy homestead." It was totally dark when the friends concealed Chet's car a distance down Willow River Road and walked to the Purdy grounds. They crept stealthily along the wall. Finding the gate unlocked, they slipped through it. The old mansion looked up, solid and dark, against a star-filled sky. The moon had not yet risen. Silently, Frank tiptoed up the front steps and tried the key. "Doesn't fit," he whispered, rejoining the other boys. "Wish Dalrymple hadn't forgotten the spare set of keys." The three slipped around to the back door, but again the key would not fit. "Cellar door," suggested Joe, feeling his way to the bulkhead nearby. Frank inserted the key. "It works," he whispered excitedly. "The fellow must keep the front door key separate." Silently, he and Joe raised the heavy doors. Frank pocketed the key, and the three cautiously went down the steps into the blackness below. The boys dared not use their flashlights, lest the beams be seen through the chinks in the flooring overhead. Frank and Joe led the way across the dank, musty cellar. Chet, shuddering a bit, followed as closely as possible. Suddenly, the plump boy gave a choked cry and sprang sideways. Crash! Clatter! Silence. At once, the Hardys turned on their flashlights. In the circle of light was Chet, lying half underneath a jumble of wooden boxes. In a hoarse, terrified voice, he gasped, "Something alive ran over my feet." Frank looked about quickly. Then he pointed. "There it is! In the corner! A rat!" Even as he spoke, the creature scurried out of sight. Frank, a bit shaken, was hauled to his feet, and the three advanced toward a stairway. "Wait," Frank commanded. "Someone's upstairs." There was a sound of voices and a creaking of floorboards above them. "The thieves?" Chet gulped. Joe started up the steps. "Let's find out," he said grimly. The three boys found the door at the top of the stairs locked. "All right," Frank whispered. "If we can't get in, we'll get them out. Make all the racket you can. We'll nab whoever comes out." Instantly, the three boys pounded on the door, hammering the walls, shouting, and stamped on the steps. In a minute, above the pandemonium, came loud voices from inside. "Hey, what's going on? Cops? A raid? Beat it!" Heavy footsteps tore through the house. Still shouting, the three youths clattered down the steps and dashed across the cellar. As they emerged from the bulkhead, two black forms leaped from a window and made for the river. And here is a picture. And the picture says, "Two black forms leaped from a window and made for the river." "Come on," cried Joe. "We've got him now." Pell-mell, the brothers raced into the woods and onto the path. Chet followed as best he could. At the river, the Hardys found a big empty motorboat floating on the dark surface. "The men are still around here," said Frank tensely. He never finished the sentence. The brothers were grabbed from behind by powerful arms and knocked to the ground. Their flashlights flew from their hands. A moment later, Frank and Joe were gagged and bound tightly. Then they were dragged off and tumbled into the boat. There was a sound of a man grunting. Then the motor whirred, caught, and roared. The boat moved out on the water. Joe and Frank saw a black receding shore on their right and realized they were heading upriver. The brothers hoped fervently that Chet had escaped. The outlines of their captors rose above the prostrate boys. Against the stars, they saw that one was tall, the other at the tiller was broad and husky with a huge jutting jaw. The man who drove the limousine, Joe told himself. What do we do with them? Muttered the tall man, crouching down. Frank and Joe waited with pounding hearts for a reply. It came. Dump them overboard. End of chapter 14. Okay, let me read one more chapter. So this is chapter 15, The Vanishing Car. To Frank and Joe, lying bound in an inch of water at the bottom of the boat, it seemed they had been speeding up the dark river for hours. The boys' arms and fingers were numb where the coarse ropes bit into their flesh, cutting off circulation. The tall man sat guard over them on a middle seat. At long intervals, he would argue with the tough, large-jawed man steering the boat. We'd be crazy to dump these kids, Sid, he muttered. Kidnapping's bad enough. It's a federal offense. Shut up, Benny. You're yellow, sneered his companion. We'll sink 'em right along here somewhere. Get the sea anchor ready. That'll do it. A chill went through the Hardys. Joe's head was jammed between the side of the boat and the middle seat. Frantically, he rubbed his head against both, hoping to loosen his gag. I tell you, I won't have any part of it, said Benny. Don't then. I'll do it myself. The muscular crook throttled down and stood up to move forward. Just as he did, Joe finally worked his gag loose. Help! He shouted. Help! Quick! As the two thieves advanced on the boy, powerful lights flashed on along shore. The full-throated roar of a big launch was heard. A siren wailed, and the motorboat was caught in the long beam of a spotlight. Instantly, the heavily built man leaped back to the stern and jammed his throttle wide open. The boat raced into the darkness. That won't save you, yelled Joe, fearful that the two desperate men might throw their captives overboard to slow up their pursuers. The police have stations all along this river. You're as good as caught. In answer, the big-jawed driver slammed the tiller from side to side. The craft lunged crazily, trying to escape the search beam. You wreck us! Screamed the tall man in terror. Yes, just like you two wrecked the Napoli in the bay, cried Joe on a sudden hunch. You don't know this river any more than you knew the harbor. It's night, and you're running without lights. The water's deep here. You won't get out of this wreck alive. He's right. We haven't a chance, Sid, the tall man pleaded. Stop her. There was a quick warning burst of machine gun fire. Muttering, Sid killed his motor. A white glare bathed the whole boat. The heavy hull of the police launch drew alongside, and a stout figure jumped into the thieves' craft. Chet! Joe cried joyously. You're here and safe! Chet cried out in relief. Quickly, he freed his two chums, while their captors were handcuffed by two officers and taken aboard the launch. As the launch turned and headed for Bayport, the Hardys leaned back in relief. Frank said, Good work, Chet. You and the police got here just in time. I saw those toughs jump you and start upriver, the plump boy explained. I ran like mad for the car and raced to the police substation up here. They radioed for a launch. Soon as it arrived, I got on. We started checking all boats and docks. Then I heard you yell, Joe. Lucky for us, partner, Frank declared gratefully, rubbing his wrists. The police launch docked briefly at the upriver substation. You boys, pick up your car here, said the commander of the boat. We'll meet you at Bayport headquarters with these two customers. After a bracing cup of hot broth at the substation, Frank, Joe, and Chet left for Bayport in Chet's car. At police headquarters, they found Chief Colleague and the officers with him, thwarted by the thugs' refusal to admit anything. We don't know nothing about any waterfront robberies, Sid snarled. You got evidence? You can't touch us without evidence. We'll charge you with kidnapping, snapped Chief Colleague. That'll do for a start. The man called Benny looked uncertain, but his accomplice taunted. Yeah, that won't tell you what you want to know. At this point, Frank spoke up. Chief, I have a strong hunch there's evidence at the Purdy place. Let Chet, Joe, and me get it. Good idea, agreed the chief. Tomlin, take a prowl car and go with them. For the second time that night, the friends drove out to the old house. On this visit, they rode up to the house, following Officer Tomlin, and let themselves in through the open window from which the thugs had escaped. Soon, lights were blazing in every room of the old mansion as the three boys and the policeman went from room to room searching. Look here! Chet yelled as he pulled open the door of a corner cupboard in the dining room and revealed a number of cardboard cartons. Tomlin and the Hardys lifted them down and opened one. It proved to contain carefully wrapped pieces of solid silver imprinted with a foreign hallmark. It's part of the stolen loot, all right, Tomlin pronounced, but it wasn't here the last time we searched. Eagerly, the four peered into the other boxes and found an assortment of fine china, expensive jewelry, a diamond ring, and gold articles which matched the description of the crewman's missing valuables. Joe frowned. I don't see Herd Applegate's collection or Captain Stroman's jade necklace. Again, the searchers went to work. They examined the third floor, the attic, and the cellar, but found nothing more. This is enough evidence to confront those two crooks with, anyhow, said Tomlin finally. They must have stowed the stuff here right after the chief's search. I'll run it in now. Right, Frank agreed. We'll follow you as soon as we pick up our flashlights. We lost them on the riverbank. They retrieved the two flashlights at the foot of the river path. The three boys passed the big house, now dark and silent once more, and walked down the driveway. That place gives me the willies, muttered Chet as Frank closed the gate. I still have the creepy feeling that somebody's in there, watching everything that goes on. They reached Chet's car and piled in. While Chet was digging for his keys, the boys heard the roar of an approaching automobile. The vehicle raced toward them without lights, veered sharply, and sped up to the Purdy gate. The driver leaped out, yanked open the gate, jumped back into the car, and drove through. After him, urged Joe. In a moment, Chet had his ancient motor running and his headlights on. He made a quick U-turn and sped in pursuit through the gate, up the driveway to the house, and around to the other side, where the road apparently ended. Quickly the boys jumped out. Before them was the dense brush which covered most of the estate. Saplings, heavily draped with leafy vines, rose up like a wall in the glare of the headlights. Frank got out and examined the ground. Tire tracks leading straight into the brush, he reported, puzzled. Joe impulsively stepped up to the leafy wall. He grasped a hanging vine and pulled hard. The whole green tangle slid along a tree branch like a drapery. A hidden road, declared Chet in wonder. He turned out the lights of his car, then cautiously the three set out on foot along the mysterious road. At intervals, they could make out bits of sky through the leaves overhead. They halted abruptly when something black and solid loomed up ahead of them. After listening carefully and hearing nothing, Frank risked the use of his flashlight. In its beam, they saw a small, tumble-down barn with a gaping doorway. Frank stooped to examine the ground. Tire tracks led straight to the dilapidated building. Joe flicked on his flashlight, and the three boys stepped warily inside the barn. The front of the old structure was empty to the roof, but in the far half of the barn was an old haymow. The front beam supporting the loft was sagging, and the dusty hay, closely matted together, spilled forward over it like a stationary waterfall. The cascade of hay formed a curtain reaching almost to the floor of the barn. Boy, said Chet, bet that hay's been here since Jason Purdy died. Then why is this pitchfork so new? Joe pointed to a tool nearby with three slender steel tines, and a clean-grained wooden handle. And where's that car? Asked Frank. He had a sudden inspiration. Frank pushed his arms through the hanging of old hay. His knuckles rapped wood. Tearing the hay aside, the boy laid bare a broad sheet of plywood with a handle. Eagerly, Frank grasped the handle. A door rolled smoothly open. Joe and Chet gasped. There, in a secret garage underneath the hayloft, was the back end of a late model Meteor Special. Frank already had penetrated to the other end of the garage. Motor's still hot, he called back. She must have just been driven in. Chet and Joe rushed over. I get it, said Joe. After the car's in, they pull down some more hay from the loft to hide the plywood. That's what the pitchfork is for. Shh. Chet put a warning finger to his lips. Hear something? A kind of moaning? Frank played his light around the garage. Nothing. He shone the flash into the back seat of the Meteor Special. Good night! He exclaimed, staring. On the floor of the car, a man lay bound and gagged. End of chapter 15. Okay. So, anyway, that is. So, right now, I read 3 chapters. So, there's 5 more chapters before I finish with this book. So far, it seems like a lot has happened in it. So, it's a really interesting book and everything. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my reading of the book, and I'll see you on the next live stream. Thank you. Bye.